This is lecture 22, Urbanization in the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1900. Urbanization is the growth and development of America's largest cities. This is directly connected, this is a direct effect of the Industrial Revolution, of industrialization. Because with industrialization came more factory work, jobs, from immigrants and from people in America that felt there was more opportunities from rural communities or from farms and making their way to the cities. The tremendous growth of American cities between 1865 and 1900. Urbanization had been taking place since the first industrial revolution, but it's going to be very profound between 1865 and 1900. The populations would especially become dense now because of the use of steel. The mass production of steel meant that architecture can now go up. We can now make skyscrapers for buildings that would have all kinds of businesses, for apartment buildings that could put down all kinds of tenants. This is what we think of in the large American cities. We're talking a lot about the East Coast America. The growth of cities gave people economic opportunities, various types of jobs in the service industry and in production. It gave people tremendous social opportunities, entertainment and nightclubs, connections with people. This is what made it so attractive to people. As a matter of fact, so many people are attracted now to the cities. For the first time in America, more people are going to live in the cities than in the rural areas and in the countryside. We would see the creation of department stores in America that also attracted people with modern day appliances and goods that you wouldn't necessarily have access to when you didn't live in the cities. And when we talk about economic opportunities, of course, for everyone, it's safe to say that it created unique opportunities for women that did not exist before. As you can see, because of the department stores, we have clerks. Over to the right, because of these new industries, we see female telephone operators, definitely secretaries. We see more what you call white-collar jobs in America than what we've ever seen before. People going to work in an office building. Okay, blue collar means those that are in the outside, maybe building things or the factories. White collar are those involved in somehow the business or indoors. Because of industrialization within the cities, you certainly saw class distinctions. You saw communities where the wealthy lived, and they were very different than where the poor lived. You definitely saw these differences of class distinctions. Where the poor lived, as you can see by the pictures, it was extremely crowded. In fact, architects purposely made these dumbbell tenements, a type of building that would house many of the working class poor, which in the eastern cities, many immigrants, families stacked in large numbers into these tight quarters. So in these areas of the cities, they were very overcrowded. And they were very unsanitary because cities and governments at the time could not keep up with the population explosion. In the later 1800s, it was not common to have sewers. So you can imagine the filth in the streets. You can imagine how the water supplies would get tainted and you would have things like cholera outbreaks. You can imagine, without the city being prepared to protect everyone, the amount of crime that was taking place. The tragedies when a fire would break out because there were no such thing as building codes. So this is a negative look at urbanization and really industrialization that came with it. Some of these pictures show the overcrowding, the how people lived in terrible conditions, children playing in the streets. We have, a dead carcass of an animal there and so forth. Also within the cities and with industrialization taking place and a small percentage of wealthy Americans in the middle of many poor Americans, we're going to see corruption take place at the local level. We already talked about corruption at the much larger level in terms of government. We're going to see corruption at the local level. And like that, we're going to see political machines. A political machine is really where some wealthy individuals kind of dominate local politics for their benefit. The most famous of the political machines that happened in the industrial era was one in New York City. It was called Tammany Hall. And again, the attention of a political machine is for some usually wealthy businessmen or wealthy businessmen that try to control local politics to protect their wealth or to add to their wealth. The most famous of the political machines out of New York City was called Tammany Hall. The man in charge of it was a man by the name of Boss Tweed. That's why this whole political machine was also called the Tweed Ring. Well, Tweed and his associates took advantage of the poor immigrants, recruited them, gave them some basic benefits like housing and jobs, all in an effort to elect his candidates into the city government. And his candidates, of course, would reward him with city contracts and city business. This is an example of a political machine. A wealthy businessman that took advantage of the poor, that took advantage of politicians to benefit him. Now, this political machine that took place in New York, it was exposed by a journalist by the name of Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was actually known for his cartoons, his political cartoons, and these are two of them, that would expose this corruption happening in local government in New York City. And we'll get more into these journalists that expose government corruption during the industrial era. The second industrial revolution and urbanization, we're going to see continued immigration, foreign immigration. And before the Civil War, we talked about old immigration, which greatly centered around the Irish and the Germans. After the Civil War, we're going to see a wave of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, called new immigration. So after the Civil War, during the Second Industrial Revolution, we would see a wave of new immigration. Eastern and Southern Europe's, coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, facing poverty, etc. Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks. These were some, included Russians, that were making their way to cities like New York, eastern cities, during the period of new immigration. Because the word in Europe was America was a land of opportunity, and a land where one could grow into a wealthy American. Many of them were processed at Ellis Island. There's a picture of it to the right. In New York City, they would be processed here, detained before they can give them legal status, as far as legal resident status. Like other immigrants, they tended to make their own little communities, Little Italy, etc., depending on each other, and worked very hard at their American dream. Now, I wouldn't classify them under this wave of new immigrants, but it's important to refer, when I talk about new immigration, this is happening in the eastern part of America. On the western part of America, simultaneous, like together with old immigration and new immigration, uh, states like California saw a lot of immigrants coming from Asia. Chinese immigration made up a large number of the immigrants that were coming in the western part of the United States. They came in the 1840s because of the gold rush, developing large communities up and down California in the western part of the United States. And initially, our federal government even welcomed them. Congress passed the Burlingame Treaty in 1868, but because we saw their value in building the railroad. The Burlingame Treaty of 1868, the federal government recruited Chinese to come to America to help build the railroad. So again, after the Civil War, it was definitely a period of huge amounts of immigrants coming to America. And would be part of city life. Now, going back to city life, the poor, the impoverished, the very sick, many times living in poverty. In America, there would be a somewhat, not a tremendous religious rival, like it wouldn't go across the states, but in the cities, the social gospel movement took place in some of these American cities, which was a movement by Christians to improve their cities. This also happened during this period. Social gospel movement, a movement by Christians to improve their cities, to help the impoverished and the immigrants to adapt to America. In this period, and coming out of the social gospel movement, we saw the creation of the Salvation Army in 1879. That purposely helped the impoverished by raising funds to help them. We would also see in the cities the settlement house movement. The social gospel movement is movement by Christians to fix cities, like we've seen before in Christian movements. Women were very much involved. Women were very sympathetic, especially to poor children and other women. The settlement house movement was a movement in the late 1800s to create a place, a settlement house, to create a place to provide services for the poor immigrants. They would teach them English. They would provide daycare, educate them on health care. These were some of the services provided by the settlement house movement in the eastern cities. One of the most popular figures of the settlement house movement was when Jane Addams, there's a picture of her to the right. James Addams was the leader of Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago, created in 1889. And we see a picture down here of a settlement house helping to feed children. So this is how Americans responded to the terrible conditions in the cities and the poor immigrants. We see some very positive responses. We see some very sympathetic responses. Another woman active in the settlement house movement was one Florence Kelley. Another leader in the settlement house movement, female leader in the settlement house movement, was Florence Kelley. She was also involved politically in helping the working poor. Besides being involved with the settlement house movement, Florence Kelley was active in child labor reform. She was active in getting political leaders to act on child labor reform. She was making speeches and talking to politicians to pass laws on child labor, because the reality is that many of these children were working many hours in these factories. So she was active in lobbying, that's the term I talked about, in influencing politicians. She was active in influencing politicians to get child labor reform, laws to help children. Now, we saw a positive reaction of Americans towards the working class poor and the immigrants in America. Well, just like the first wave of immigrants, we're going to see some Americans are going to practice nativism. Nativism, again, is this hatred of foreigners, this attempt to prevent immigrants from coming into America. During the first wave of immigrants, remember the Know Nothing Party, political party designed to try to prevent more immigrants from coming into America. Well, here in the later 1800s, we see it once again, like the American Protective Association, passed in 1887, created in 1887. Had around 1 million members. And they were urging their voters not to vote for Catholic candidates for office. And their intention, again, was to protect American jobs from immigrants. Specifically at the Chinese, this anti-immigrant belief became very strong in California. The Chinese Exclusion Act would be passed in 1882, which would end legal immigration from China. Anti-immigrant groups in California were really pushing government leaders that they were taking away jobs from Americans. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 to end legal immigration from China. You can see the picture here, you see the picture over here where they're greatly reducing and even putting quotas on the number of immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe especially. They would be way more open to those coming again from England and Ireland, etc., Western Europe. But those coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, they put these restrictions on. Now, these women from the social gospel movement, again, are active, like in the era of reform, in trying to end the consumption of alcohol. We're going to see a crusade for the prohibition of alcohol in the late 1800s within the American cities. The organization known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union was created in 1874. Its leader was Frances Willard. This organization put pressure on the states to abolish alcohol, arguing that it only made the conditions in the cities worse in terms of family life and the creation of crime and so forth. Following this organization, at the turn of the century, the Anti-Saloon League was created in 1893, which is again self-explanatory. Greatly wanted to put restrictions on the consumption of alcohol. And by the early 1900s, this movement will be successful in getting an amendment to end alcohol. As we know, the 18th Amendment, this is the beginning of that fight for the 18th Amendment. Just like the era of reform, women were active. They continue to be active in their fight to get voting rights. By the late 1800s, that was the intention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, a national organization was calling for women's suffrage. Fighting for the rights for women to vote. And this organization was actually trying in that fight state by state. It's what they call the winning plan. They try to get women the right to vote state by state, hoping that would influence the federal government. And of course, they're going to get their amendment, but not until 1920. The conditions of the cities we're going to see are going to start being exposed by journalists. Journalists are going to expose this to the wealthy and to the middle class and to people that didn't live in the cities. And it's going to shock Americans. We're going to see journalists known as the Reformed Press, as in change press, as in, call out our American leaders and say, this can be better. Here's some examples of some of the Reformed Press, or what later on we're going to call muckrakers, because they expose the problems in society. A couple examples of these muckrakers. Edward Bellamy. He wrote a book in 1888 called Looking Backward. And it was a book about socialism. It was a book that was pro-socialism. And he used the poverty of capitalism in America as an excuse. Jacob A. Riis really had a huge impact in terms of being a muckraker of the Reformed Press. With his book in 1890, How the Other Half Lives. Jacob A. Riis was a photographer who put together this book of photographs. He went into the slums of New York. He went into the tenements of New York and took very real pictures of the terrible conditions that shocked many Americans. You can see this would all put pressure eventually on the government to call for change. Jacob A. Riis, part of this Reform Press, How the Other Half Lives, 1890. A book of pictures that expose the conditions in the cities. So here's some themes under urban America. Again, make the connection, industrialization and the growth of cities. Of course, describe the conditions of urban America. And think of the positive and the negative. Number 2, how did urbanization impact the status of women in American society? Number 3, analyze the various ways in which political machines, social crusaders, people that wanted to fix society, nativists, people that hated foreigners, and businesses respond to the new immigration. How did these various groups treat the new immigrants in America, and why?